Are your adult children still living at home? Are you struggling to support them financially while also planning for your own future? Well, today we're going to dive into a listener's question about the challenges of supporting grown kids who haven't left the nest. We're going to explore some practical advice, I'm going to give you some biblical wisdom, and we're going to talk about some real life case studies to help you navigate this complex situation. We're going to discover the hidden cost of supporting adult children, why they might not be leaving the nest at home, how to set healthy financial boundaries, how to deal with manipulative behavior and sibling rivalry, and I'm going to give you biblical principles to guide you through this journey, as well as some strategies to encourage financial independence, and we're going to end it all with the power of prayer and seeking God's guidance. So don't miss this crucial discussion as we provide actionable steps and spiritual insights to help you balance love and responsibility.
In a world where crushing debt keeps you trapped, where living paycheck to paycheck has become your new normal, and where the dream of retirement seems impossibly out of reach, there's hope. Join financial evangelist Ralph E. Stepp Jr., a man who's walked through the fire of financial failure and emerged stronger on the other side. Welcome to Ask Ralph, the show where real-world experience meets biblical truth to break the bondage of financial despair. Get ready to take control of your money, break free from the financial stress, and align your resources with God's purpose for your life. This is Ask Ralph with Ralph E. Stepp Jr.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Ask Ralph Show. This is your weekly live show where we tackle tough questions about faith and finance and, hey, just about everything in between. And today we've got a particularly compelling question from one of our listeners that I think many of you can relate to. It's about the challenge of supporting adult children who are still living at home. Hey, this is a situation that's becoming increasingly common, and it's causing a lot of stress, and it's causing financial strains for parents. But first, let's hear from our listener who sent in this question, and they're struggling with this very situation. Here's what they had to say. It says, "Dear Ralph, I'm really struggling right now. My daughter, who is 28, has been living at home for the past 3 years. She had a rough time finding a job after college and has been dealing with student loan debt. At first, I was happy to support her, but it's been taking a toll on my finances and my peace of mind. I'm paying for the groceries, I'm paying for the phone bill, and even her car insurance. Feels like she's taking advantage of my kindness, and I'm not sure how to handle it. I've tried talking to her about getting a job, but she always has an excuse. Either the job market is tough or she's not feeling well. I'm torn because I want to help her, but I also need to think about my own future. I'm 55 and I haven't been able to save much for retirement because of these expenses. I feel guilty saying no, but I'm getting overwhelmed. Can you give me some advice on how to navigate this situation? I want to do what's best for both of us, but I'm not sure where to start. Thank you." And that was signed a conflicted parent. And let me just tell you, that is a powerful question. So today we're going to get into a topic that many of you have been asking me about. I've gotten several emails and several notices about this. What to do when your grown kids won't fly the coop. Are your adults' kids still at home? If they are, you're not alone. And so I'm going to start by asking this very interesting question. And that's this: have you ever stopped to consider just how much it's costing you to support your adult children financially? And let me just tell you, these numbers might just shock you. You ready for this? On average, parents spend around, and listen to this, you're not going to believe this, about $1,400 a month supporting their adult children. Now, you might be saying, "Ralph, what makes that up?" Well, this includes groceries, it includes rent, phone bills, sometimes even credit card bills, vacations, tuition, and car expenses. For Gen Z and baby boomer parents, this financial burden is often higher. Listen to this study. According to a study, parents who support their adult children could lose up to, and ready for this one, $227,000 in retirement savings. They could lose up to that because they're still supporting their adult children. And listen, think about that for a minute. This can significantly impact your future financial security. Let me just tell you about some of the common expenses that parents are covering. This is what I found in my research. In general, groceries, 76%. 76% of parents are covering some level of groceries. 44% are covering rent. 39% are covering phone bills. 23% are covering credit card bills. 15% are covering vacations. 10% are covering tuition, and car expenses are 8%. Hey, this is a significant strain on household budgets, especially for those who are nearing retirement. So I'm going to give you a bunch of pro tips today, and I'm going to start with this one right away because I want to give you actionable things that you can work on today. So here's my first pro tip. Track your expenses to understand the full impact of supporting your adult children. Because if you don't really know how much you're spending, you might have just heard me say those things and you're probably thinking, Ralph, I don't spend anywhere near that. Well, guess what? That is the average. So if you're tracking these things, that's why I said this is my first pro tip, is to look at that. See what you're spending because it's going to help you make an informed decision about your financial future. So let me ask you this question. Have you ever wondered why your adult children are still living at home? Because I think that's where we need to start this discussion. We talked already about what it's costing you, but let's talk about why your adult children are still living at home, because I think these reasons might surprise you. And when I did my research for the show today, here's what I found. The biggest one is financial pressures. It's that high cost of living, an expensive housing market. It's expensive to live on your own. And here's another thing that a lot of people don't talk about. It's that student loan debt. All those things are very common. So that's the first thing, these financial pressures, the high cost of living. Yeah, it's expensive. My youngest son is going through this. He lives on his own. It's not cheap. The housing market, especially where we live in our area, is expensive. And a lot of people are burdened with this student loan debt. Another reason is job market challenges. There are precarious work environments. It's difficult finding stable, well-paying jobs. If you've been in the market for a job, a lot of people say, well, if you don't want to work right now, you can find a job. Well, that's not necessarily true. Again, it depends on your skill set and it depends on your adaptability, whether you're willing to take on that job. Another big reason is what I'll call societal shifts. Later age for milestones like marriage and homeownership. A lot of people are deciding now, and I'm not saying that I'm disagreeing with this, but a lot of people are deciding to get married later. They're deciding to buy that first house later. They're deciding to have children later. And that just is a overall societal shift. And that's okay. I'm just wanting to point that out to you as we discuss why our adult children are still in the nest. Another one is family dynamics. A lot of times we've got really close relationships. That get at comfort of home and that potential for mutual benefit because, hey, here's the truth. A lot of children are helping out with their parents. They're helping them pay bills, and maybe they're helping them with their financial situation. Maybe they're helping them with doing things around the house or those type of things. We got this term that's thrown around called failure to launch, and it's often used to describe this situation. And see, societal comfort levels have shifted on this. Now it's much more acceptable for adult children to live at home longer. So here's my next pro tip. You got to understand the reasons behind your child's extended stay so that you can help address the root causes and find solutions that work for both of you. Because that's really the key. Hey, it could be a situation like I was talking to somebody in my office here yesterday, and she said, Ralph, sometimes the kids are asked to stay there, the adult children. I call them kids, but adult children. They're asked to stay there because they're helping out. Maybe they're helping with some medical issues. Maybe they're helping, fund the household. That's just a legitimate thing. Now, the goal of my show today was talk about when those adult children won't fly the coop and it's this financial burden. So I'm going to make an assumption for today's discussion that we're talking about a situation where they won't leave and it's causing a financial struggle. So let me move on to the next topic and let me ask you another question. Have you ever considered how supporting your adult children might be jeopardizing your own retirement plans? And that's what I want to talk about. I want to park here for just a couple minutes and talk about the financial side of this, because here is the truth. Many parents prioritize their children's expenses over their own retirement savings. And listen, I see this time and time again in my practice. People will come in and meet with me and I'll sit down with them and they'll say, Ralph, I really want to put more aside for retirement, but I've still got my son living with me or I've still got my daughter living with me. And I said, wait a minute, these kids are like 30 years old. When are they going to fly the coop or at least contribute to what's going on at the house? Because if you don't recognize that, we talked about that number, that $227,000 number at the beginning of the show today. And that is going to impact your retirement. Basically, you're not able to put away as much money because you're paying those expenses. And listen, at the end of the day, this can lead to delayed retirement or even financial insecurity later in life. And listen to this study, like I talked about before. Parents who support their adult children. Like I said, this is a big number. $227,000 in retirement savings. Hey, listen, I don't know about you, but that could have a significant impact on your future financial security. Now, this is a Christian faith show, so we got to talk about the biblical side of this. Now, we are called to be good stewards of our resources and plan for the future. Proverbs chapter 6, verses 6 through 8 reminds us to be wise and prepare for the future. But it's critical and it's crucial to prioritize your own retirement and your emergency funds. Now, this doesn't mean you can't support your children. You're never going to hear me say, I don't think you should support your children. That's not what I'm saying at all. But you have to find that balance. It's so important to find that balance with your needs and theirs. And listen, if you've got a kid that's riding a sofa in the basement, hey, it's time to put them to work, maybe charge them some rent. So here's another pro tip. Set aside a specific portion of your income for retirement savings and treat that as a non-negotiable expense. And I'll dare say this. Make that the first payment. Now, if you want to support your kids, you want to help them out, that's fine. But make sure you're covering your bases first. Make sure you're putting that money away for retirement later. So let's move on to our next big thing to discuss. And let me ask you this. Have you struggled with setting those financial boundaries with your adult children? If you are, you're not alone. I hear this time and time again. But listen, it's crucial for not only their growth, but also for your financial health. Here are some very practical strategies. One of the things I wanted to cover on today's show is I wanted to make sure I was going to give you some practical strategies of how to handle this situation. Because listen, I see this a lot. I see this routinely, and it causes struggle. So one of the first things I'm going to tell you to do, I think this one is the most crucial thing, is you've got to establish clear rules and expectations. You got to emphasize that need for open communication. You need to have a discussion with your kids. It's okay to say to your kids, listen, I can't continue to pay for all these things. I can't continue to support you. You're able to work. You're able to bring in money. Now, which leads me to the second thing. And this is going to be controversial. A lot of people might send me hate mail about this one, but maybe you've got to consider charging rent. Now, again, it depends on the situation. If your adult child has the ability to work and they aren't helping out around the house, and it doesn't necessarily have to be rent. It could be, hey, you're eating the food here. You're eating the groceries. It's costing us more for utilities. Our electric bill is more. Our water bill is more. Hey, I'm paying for your insurance. I'm paying for your car payments. It is okay. Yeah, Ralph said it. It's okay to suggest a reasonable amount or a percentage of their income be paid in rent. That's just a truth. Here's a great example. Let's say husband and wife, and you've got a kid living there with you. Well, basically the truth is maybe that kid needs to kick up a third of that. That's what's going on. I mean, if you think about it, if that person is not paying for their groceries, if they're not paying for their share of the utilities, which leads me to the next practical piece of advice, and that is define who is responsible for specific bills and share those expenses. It's okay. For example, I was dealing with a friend of mine not too long ago, and he was making a list of all the different subscriptions they have to their TVs and their internet. And he says, I'm the one paying all these bills. He says, Ralph, I don't even watch these things. I don't even connect to these things. I gave him some really bold advice. I said, turn them off. And I said, and if your kids, and these are adult kids we're talking about. These are kids who have the capacity to work. They have their own jobs. I said, turn them off. And if they want them, let them sign up for them in their name. Now, the downside to that is he says, yeah, but Ralph, they don't even have their own credit cards. Well, ding, 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 there's another problem. Get them to start managing their own money. Now, another thing I want to talk about here in the practical discussion here is let's have a discussion about loans versus gifts, because you've got to really be clear and you've got to discuss this. You've got to structure financial assistance with either, hey, this is a gift or this is a loan, but you've got to be clear about that, because what happens from an emotional standpoint, if you don't lay those things out in clear details, you may just be building animosity on both of you. And listen, I think it's okay if you say to your child, hey, excuse me, you want to come back for 3 to 6 months? That's fine. But you're going to need to help out. You're going to need to contribute. And if you're not, then guess what? I'm starting a loan. I said this to my youngest son one time. I said, hey, I'm not the bank of dad. It's just not the way it works. I said, if you want us to pay for stuff, that's fine. We'll give you a line of credit. But listen, number one, and again, I might get hate messages about this. Number one, you're going to pay us interest. Number two, you're going to make us monthly payments. Listen, for example, my youngest is on my cell phone bill. He has his own job. He has his own place to live. And every month, I put him on our cell phone bill. But I say to him, hey, dude, where's your money for your cell phone bill? It's okay to do that. It's okay to say, hey, this is not something we're just going to cover in perpetuity. You're past the age of when we supported you. Another practical strategy is limit discretionary spending. This is where you've got to focus on their essential needs. For example, like I talked about with the person with the subscription services. Hey, if you've got a child that's struggling, and again, I say adult child, it's not the time to pay for those little extras. I had a client in the other day. It was kind of funny the way he said it to me, and I don't know if I'll recall it directly. I think he said he turned 18 and he wasn't going to college and all this kind of stuff. And his parents said, okay, that's great. Well, you want to stay here? That's fine. Here's your rent. This is what's going to cost you a month. And he said, I remember, Ralph, he says, well, a week or so ago, or a week or so after that, he said, my mom had started making dinner. And I said, oh, what are we having for dinner? She says, this is dinners for your father and I. If you want to eat dinner with us, I can certainly make you a plate, but it's going to be $10. Now, a lot of people might be saying, Ralph, how could they do that? Well, again, you're trying to teach your kids to be independent. I'm not saying to be nasty with them. I'm not saying to be difficult with them. But listen, if you don't start to give them the ability to make better decisions, if you don't help build in that financial independence, you are going to have a child that is going to live with you the rest of your life. And guess what? You're not going to be able to afford it. Because retirement isn't designed to focus on you and your child. It's designed to focus on you. So focus on those essential needs. Now, here's another great practical thing. Set a timeline. Discuss the expected duration of a living arrangement and the milestones for independence. It's okay to say to your child, listen, I know you're struggling right now. Maybe they lost their job. Maybe they're just out of college and they're just working to get that first job. It's okay to say to them, hey, you've got 3 months, you've got 6 months, you've got 9 months, but frame that boundary. It's an act of love that ultimately benefits them because you're going to foster responsibility in them. You don't want to enable them. I have seen this so many times. I remember 2 or 3 years ago, I had a client come in and she was almost in tears sitting in my office. She goes, Ralph, I'm running out of money because I'm still supporting my 50-year-old adult child. Well, if you don't have an expectation with them, if you don't set strong limits and all those type of things, you are going to have an adult child that's never going to leave. Now, again, I'm not talking about people or adult children who have disabilities. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about adult children who can't do things on their own. I'm talking about children who decide not to do things on their own because guess what? There's a lot of that goes on. And remember, look at the book of Ephesians 4:15. I don't have time to cover it right now, but it reminds us about speaking truth in love. I'm going to encourage you to go read it because that's what you need to do here. You need to speak truth in love to your adult children and say, listen, I really love you. I really want to help you, but the best way I can help you is not to continue to enable you. So here's another pro tip. I told you I'd give you a lot of pro tips today. There's a lot of these. I'll also put them in the show notes. But write down the boundaries and the expectations you've agreed on with your child. I said you've agreed on, but you've agreed on with your child. It's like a contract. Have a clear written agreement. That way you avoid any misunderstandings and conflicts because you don't want that. You don't want those misunderstandings. You don't want those conflicts because what happens is, and I actually had this in my own family. I'll tell a little personal story here. About 10 years ago, I guess, my sister and my mom were living together, and my mother, God rest her soul, she'd just been dead 2 years now the other day, and I was thinking about this the other day, and this isn't throwing any negative towards my sister, but my mom would constantly put me in the middle of this conversation between her and my sister. She'd call me and say, Ralph, I don't understand, your sister's not helping out, your sister's, and again, I'm not choosing sides. But first of all, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, that sibling rivalry thing, but my mom put me on the spot. She said, Ralph, can you talk to your sister? And I remember I had had enough one day. My wife and I, we were out to eat one night, and I said, you know what? I'm done. I drove right to my mother's house. I will never forget this. My wife says, I'm going to sit in the car because I don't want to get involved in this. I went in, sat in my mother's rec room, and I said to the two of them, I said, listen, I am tired of being in the middle of this. You guys need to figure out your stuff on your own. And it was all because there was no clear understanding. There was no clear expectation of what was expected of each of them. And I said, I don't need to be in the middle of this. You need to put those things in writing so that there are no conflicts. So let me ask you this, and this is where we're going to get into it's going to be a difficult conversation. And that's this question. Have you ever felt manipulated or guilted by your adult children when it comes to financial support? Because listen, I've had situations, not in my own life. My kids are pretty responsible, especially my oldest son and my youngest son. I only have two sons, but they're very responsible. They know that they're not going to come to me. I'm not the bank of dad anymore. But there are situations that I hear about from clients where their adult children are, frankly, they're being manipulative. They're just nasty to their parents, and they're putting a guilt trip on them. And listen, if you're a parent listening to this, you got to recognize those things, and you've got to address that manipulative behavior, because you got to set those healthy boundaries. I remember one time I was in counseling. Yes, Ralph went to counseling, believe it or not. Well, anyway, this counselor was a Christian counselor. He was an associate pastor at our church, and he said, Ralph, and I don't remember what we were talking about. We were talking about boundaries in some regard. And he says, Ralph, he says, think about this. I live out in the country. Now, he lived out near where I live now, and he had this house, and right next door to him was an Amish farm. Now, Amish farm, if you're not familiar with the Amish, it's a very religious sect. They don't really use cars. They don't use electricity, all that kind of things. They're sort of, I don't want to say negative in a good way. In a good way, they're set in their ways. They just kind of separate themselves. Well, anyway, whole point of the story was, he said, I can't really blame my neighbor when his cow wanders into my backyard if I haven't built a fence. And he says, so what I'm trying to explain to you is, I needed to set that boundary. Now, once I set the boundary, if his cow was like coming, and I got cows, I raise Black Angus cows, I get it. But if you don't set those boundaries, with your kids, you're going to have these problems. So it is so important to recognize that manipulative behavior, such as guilt trips or emotional blackmail or them playing the victim. Because these tactics can make it difficult to set those boundaries, but you've got to recognize those things. And as the listener said here in her message today, she says, Ralph, I feel guilty, but I feel like she's taking advantage of me. So I promised you some effective strategies. So here are some effective strategies for handling that manipulation. And the first one is what we just talked about. You've got to set clear boundaries. Communicate your limits firmly and calmly. You don't have to go crazy about it. You don't have to scream about it and pound on the walls and throw stuff. But communicate your limits firmly and calmly, and dare I say, put them in writing. And then once you do that, once you've had that, what we'll call the meeting of the minds, and it might come down to saying, listen, I remember when I was a kid, my mom and dad, and mostly my mom, because I live with my mom and dad split up, but my mom said, look, if you want to live under this roof, you're going to follow the rules. Well, guess what? When I'm an adult child, if I want to live under their roof, I got to follow the rules. That's just the truth. And then once you set those boundaries, and look, it might be a very difficult conversation. It might be one of those conversations that you just do not want to have. But listen, as the guy said about the Amish farmer next door, if I don't set the boundaries, Ralph, how can I even argue that they're going against those boundaries? So once you set those boundaries, the next step is to stick to your principles. Don't give in to emotional pressure. Don't give in to the woe is me or the sad, I can't find a job. I can't do this. I can't do that. Now, again, there may be reasons why they can't do it, but don't buy into that emotional pressure, because all you're doing is teaching them to be more manipulative. Another thing I'm going to do is tell you to encourage accountability. Help your adult children see the consequences of their actions. Say to them, hey, when you don't go to work, is it a big shock that you're not getting paid? Is it a big shock that you lose your job? Is it a big shock you don't take care of yourself? These are their consequences. And as a parent, and I've learned this, my kids are 23. My son will soon be 24. My oldest is 27. I guess it was about, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago. I can't remember exactly when, but somebody said this. And I said, this is brilliant. They said, you have to be the parent that allows your children to fail. And see, that's not a popular thing to say. People get upset when you say, I can't dare sit there and watch my children fail. But I see adults entering retirement who are failing because of the fact that they won't let their children fail. I'm going to tell a very rough story, but there was a time when my youngest son decided he wasn't going to school anymore. And I told him, I said, dude, when you're 18, there's the door. And he ended up living in his truck for 2 weeks. And a lot of people say, Ralph, how could you do that to him? Well, guess what? Living in his trucks 2 weeks, it taught him a very, very important thing. And that is, I better work. I better make money. Yes, it was hard for me. It was hard for me to do that for him. And you notice I said do that for him. I didn't say do that to him. I said to do that for him, because it doesn't help anybody if you are not showing them how to be independent, which leads me to my next thing that I think you really need to consider doing. And that is, if you're in that situation where there's manipulation, hey, it could even be threats of violence and all those sort of things. That's when you need to bring in professional help. Maybe consider family therapy or counseling if you need it. Because there is a point where maybe you can't get past the manipulation. Maybe there was other things going on. I don't know exactly what's going on in your world, but maybe there was other things, and you really need somebody to sit down and help with you. The Bible has principles on honesty and integrity as well, and they can help guide us with this manipulative behavior. Look at Proverbs 12:22 when you get a chance. It reminds us that the Lord detests lying lips, but delights in people who are trustworthy. So my big takeaway here is try to find that balance between love and firmness, because that's really the key. So here's another pro tip, and listen to me on this one. And again, these will all be in the show notes. Practice assertive communication techniques to express your needs and those boundaries clearly and confidently. Let me say that again. Be assertive. Be assertive in communicating what you want for your needs and your boundaries. Make them clear and say them with confidence. This is your home. These are your resources. As I said to a client the other day, you have no obligation to provide for an adult child that has the capacity to provide for themselves. And again, I caution you to say, I'm saying very clearly, if they have the ability to take care of themselves. So here's another important question to ask. Have you ever experienced that sibling rivalry? We talked about this a few minutes ago, or the tension among your children due to the financial support you provide? Listen, I see this all the time. It kind of happened a little bit in my world. I shared that with my mom and sister, because if you don't address these dynamics, you are going to have major family disharmony. Let me say that 10 times over. I'm tripping over my words today. But if you don't address these dynamics, you are going to struggle with financial harmony. Listen, I remember growing up, my sister's about 3.5 years younger than me. There's sibling rivalry already. But if one child perceives that another is receiving more financial support or more favor, man, you are in for it. You are going to have tension, and you are going to have resentment within the family. So let's take a few minutes and just talk about some practical strategies to avoid that or to correct it if you are in that position. Because let me just tell you, those type of things will cause problems that will reverberate for the rest of your days. You will always have that child that says, well, and I hear this all the time, well, mom always bailed him out, or dad always bailed her out. You need to stop that. I'm not saying that every child gets treated the same, because you may, like I said, you may have a child that doesn't have the capacity, or maybe they didn't have the skills, but you need to coach them on this. But here are some practical strategies to get past that. The first thing, I go back to communication again. You've got to be transparent in your communication. Explain your decisions openly and honestly to all your children. If there is something that you're doing for one and you're not doing to the other, then sit down and have a discussion about it. Another thing I'm going to encourage you is what I call equal opportunity. I met with a client yesterday. Here's an example of this. His grandmother just passed away. Now, he's got 2 other brothers. Now, I don't know the circumstances of the whole thing, but the grandmother left him her house. And he sat down with me and he says, Ralph, he says, you know what? I don't want to get into all that, but he says, what I'm doing is as soon as this house sells, I'm going to share it with everybody, because I think, and he didn't say this, but I think what he was saying is like, I don't know why my grandmother did this. she kind of put me in this bad spot. So again, if you're a parent listening to this, give your children equal opportunity. Ensure that each child has the opportunity to receive support based on their needs and circumstances. Again, if you have a child that has special needs, and I'm talking about adult children here, if you have an adult child that needs your help, then there may be seasons where you have to help them. There may be seasons where they live with you. Maybe they've went through a divorce. Maybe they've gone through a job change. Maybe they lost their job. Maybe they were injured. Maybe they had a disability. All of those things can happen. And that's when you have that conversation as a family. You sit down and you talk about, which I'm going to get to here in a second. But you sit down and have a conversation and say, listen, hey, Joe broke his leg. Joe can't afford to work right now. Maybe he works in construction, you say, and he can't afford to make his car payment, or he can't afford to live on his own. He can't afford his rent. Well, guess what? Mom and dad, or dad and I, are going to support Joe, but here's the plan. We're going to do it for 6 months. Here's his expectation is when we get past it, he's going to pay us back. It all comes down to what I'm going to say next. And that is, when you're dealing with multiple children, you've got to set clear expectations. Establish those clear rules and those clear expectations for any financial assistance, and communicate these to all of your children. It is so important that you don't talk to one and not talk to the other. That's one of the things, and I don't mean to hold it against my mom, but she did this her entire life. She would always play one against another, and all it did was cause problems, not for her and I, but for my sister and I. And when she would constantly call me, Ralph, your sister's not doing this. Your sister's doing this. And I said, Mom, it's not my responsibility. This is your responsibility. And that's why I had enough. I pulled them all into the room together. I said, we're going to figure this out, because this is not my circus. This is not my issue. Another thing I'm going to tell you is, as we talk about sibling rivalry, is to encourage independence. This goes with whether you're dealing with siblings or you're just dealing in general. You've got to encourage independence from your children. They are not intended to be under your care for the rest of their lives. Yes, you can love them. You should love them. You should pray for them. You should want to be a part of their lives. But listen, you've got to start to build that independence. I think that's one of the, okay, Ralph's going to get on his soapbox here for a minute. But I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have, is we're raising kids that aren't being taught to be independent. We raised our two boys to be independent. We taught them about money. We taught them about handling their laundry, for example. We taught them about how to cook, how to do all those things. I was talking with a lady that works here with me, and she said this yesterday to me. She says, Ralph, I was one of those latchkey kids. And I said, I was too. My mom and dad split up. Guess what? Mom had to go back to work. So I would get home from school around 3 o'clock, 3:15, whatever. And I had some expectations. My mom expected me to start dinner. My mom expected me to handle my homework. My mom expected me to do things. Well, guess what? Now, I could look back at that and say, well, that really stunk. It would have been nice if my mom was home. But guess what? And I said this to my colleague. I said, you know what? I said, that built me into the person I am today. It really did. It made me understand the importance of being independent. And listen, if you don't take away anything else from today's show, encourage your children to be independent and start that young. You don't need, and see, here's one of the problems. From a psychological perspective, I'm not a counselor, I'm not a psychiatrist, don't even play one on TV. But I think sometimes parents actually build that dependence because the parent doesn't want to let go. You're not helping your kids out by doing that. You're doing them a disservice. My wife has a brother. He's the same age as I am. He cannot do anything on his own because his parents never taught him to be independent. Now, he has some issues that I think prevented some of that, but they could have done a better job. So you've got to foster that sense of independence and teach that responsibility in every child, regardless of the support they receive. If you're going to help a child, then make sure you're looking at what is the end here? What is the deadline? What is that time? We talked about that a little bit earlier in the show. What are you trying to get to where they can find that independence and be on their own? Now, here's another thing I'm going to encourage, and that is have family meetings. One of the things that could have prevented this whole issue with my mom and sister and I is if my mom just said, you know what? I'm going to call your brother and the three of us are going to get down. Now, again, I don't think I should have been involved. It wasn't my house. I wasn't paying any of their bills. But again, that would have been fine. Have a family meeting. So I'm going to encourage you, if you're going through these situations, hold those regular family meetings to discuss these financial matters and address any concerns or tensions. Have a frank discussion. But again, stand your ground. It's your house, it's your resources. So consider this. Here's another pro tip. Maybe you want to create a family budget that outlines the financial support each child receives and then share it with them. This can help ensure the transparency, it can help ensure fairness, and it can reduce the potential for sibling rivalry. As an example, I know I guess it was about 30 years ago, my mom had two sisters, and my mom's youngest sister, I guess it would be my youngest, my aunt, all tied up here, knots. But anyway, my grandparents on my mother's side helped her out by buying her a home. And at the time, I remember the discussion, and I don't know why I was involved in this, but again, my mom shared everything with me. That's what happens when your parents get divorced and you're left to be the man in the house. But that's a discussion for a whole nother day. But anyway, what was conveyed to me, what I heard was that, hey, we're helping out your aunt so that when we pass away, your aunt is going to get less. And again, this is all part of that transparency. It's all part of that fairness, but you've got to build it in, because what you don't want to create, and I've seen this, so I say this in my practice all the time, death brings out the ugly in people, like people who are very nice people who get along with their brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles. Man, when somebody dies, it's like game on sometimes. They do stuff, you're like, where did that come from? But now let's consider this. Have you ever wondered, and this is where we're going to get biblical, have you ever wondered how biblical principles can help guide you in supporting your adult children financially? And these answers might just surprise you. See, I always want to bring it back to that, because I think that's where we truly find the answers. Biblically speaking, transitions from parental authority to an adult relationships they should be based on respect and honor. This is essential. This is all throughout Scripture. You need to understand that relationship needs to be based on respect and honor. It talks in the Bible about, respect your children, honor your parents. Scriptures, and I'm going to encourage you to read these. I don't have time to cover them today, but scriptures like Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1, Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, they guide us in understanding the changing dynamics of those parent-child relationships. That's all biblical. Yes, you can tie it back right to that. There is biblical for what I'm talking about today. And helping a child in genuine need is different from enabling their dependence. I'm not talking about helping a child that's in need. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that you shouldn't help your adult child, because guess what? We all have issues in our lives. I recorded a show today, and I don't want to spill it, but I talked about how when I was about 20 years old, I wasn't independent. I was still in college. My dad was paying my bills, and man, I had a car issue. So I'm going to encourage you to check out next Tuesday's episode when I talk about that. I'll talk about emergency funds. But see, sometimes you've got to be that parent that steps up and say, you know what, there's a genuine need here. But that is completely different than enabling. So how do you handle that? Well, you got to trust God's guidance in your child's life and allow them to learn from their experiences and their consequences. I talked about this a few minutes ago. It's okay to watch your children fail. That's not a popular thing to say. People are like, oh, Ralph, I can't believe you just said that. Well, guess what? They're never going to learn if they don't fail. Now, my dad was always, son, you can learn from other people's failures. Yes, you would hope so. But I think there comes a time, and if you're not careful about this, you will enable your children. So let them make those decisions, make them suffer the consequences. Now, I'm not telling you to make them do something they can't get back from. Not at all. That's a time when you might need to step in. But you've got to start building a balance between support and self-reliance, because it is so very important to balance support with that biblical call for independence. It's a tough thing to balance. It's tough, especially if you're in one of those manipulative situations or on that guilt trip. And again, this is where you've got to trust God's guidance in your child's life. Hopefully you've brought the child up in understanding who the Lord is and understanding what that looks like. And then again, like I said, let them learn from their experiences and have their consequences. It's crucial. Another thing it talks about in the Bible is open communication. That's all throughout the Bible. You got to reinforce the importance of respectful dialogue. No, don't let your kids sit there and tear you down. Don't let your kids sit there and manipulate you and put you into a position of guilt. Look at the book of Proverbs 15:1. It reminds us that a gentle answer turns away wrath, But then the next thing it says, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So here's another pro tip. I want to encourage you to do this. Schedule regular financial check-ins with your adult child to discuss their progress, discuss their challenges and their goals. Now listen, one of the rules that my wife and I have is we don't get into our kids' finances unless they come to us and say, Mom, Dad, I need help. Listen, if they need help, guess what? Game on. I'm an accountant. I want to see your bank statements. I want to see your credit card statements. I want to see your bank. I want to see your pay stubs. I want to know where your money's going. You might be saying, wait a minute, that's intrusive on your kid. No, it's not. Because if that kid comes to me, and I'm talking about adult kids here, I'm talking about younger kids, I'm talking about adult kids. If that adult kid comes to me and says, oh, Mom, oh, Dad, I need help, that sounds great. Then you know what? We're going to look at it all. Because that will help you keep the lines of communication open. Now, if they don't want to share it, that's fine. Then don't ask us for money. It's really that simple. But make sure you leave those communication lines open and foster that sense of accountability. They need to be accountable. So let me ask you this. Have you ever felt at a loss on just how to encourage your adult children to become financially independent? We kind of been going around the bend on this. So I'm going to give you some strategies that will help you. I'm going to call them actionable advice for parents. How do we get them to be financially independent? Because we talked about, why they should be. We talked about how to handle manipulation. We talked about how to communicate. We talked about the prayer side of this. But how do you actually foster, what are the actionable things that you can do as parents to help build that financial independence? I think one of the things that you absolutely have to do is be open and communicate your expectations and timelines. Be clear and consistent. If you have a belief that your child should be out of the house at a certain date, at a certain age, then you've got to communicate that. It's not fair to a kid or an adult kid to say, hey, you've been sitting around this house for 3 years now, and when are you going to do something? If you've never said to them, hey, our expectation, my expectation if you're a single parent is this. If you don't do that, if you don't set that up, you can't blame your kid for surfing on the couch the rest of their life. If you've not given them an exit ramp, if you've not said to them, hey, here's the expectation, here's what we expect from you, which leads me to the next thing. And this is things I think a lot of parents screw up. And that is you've got to gradually phase out that financial assistance. I'm not telling you to turn off the spigot right away, man. That's not the way to do it because you could cause reverberations with them that could go on and on and on. But you've got to look at a phased in approach and communicate this. Have that discussion. No, hey, listen, for the next 6 months, Dad and I are going to pay for this, this, and this. Then after that 6 months, we're going to pay for this, this, and this. And look at it as a way for them to build that self-sufficiency gradually. It's kind of like when you were growing up. No kid was earning enough money for the Friday night dance and paying their car payment, all this kind of stuff. But you know what? You've got to build in that gradual climb to where they're able to take those steps on their own, which leads me to the next thing. You've got to teach financial literacy. We are doing a terrible job in this country of teaching our kids basic financial literacy. Yes, I said it. And the problem is, for the most part, most adults don't have good financial literacy. That's just the truth bomb. Well, if you're not teaching your kids because you don't know how to do it, guess what? There's going to be a problem. So teach them about budgeting. Maybe you got to learn it at the same time. Teach them about emergency funds, about managing money, about saving, retirement, and understanding credit. Because here's the truth. When I have a client come in and they start telling me about the financial woes they're having, 9 times out of 10, I can look at their parents and say, I would bet that your parents had those same struggles. Or if I look at kids, like adult kids who may be in their young 20s, and they can't save and they can't, manage their money, I can look at their parents and go, I bet your parents struggle with the same thing. And I'm not picking on, I'm not judging anybody. It is just a truth. So you've got to start to foster that education at a young age. I remember with my 2 boys, hey, listen, and I'm not sitting here preaching you, telling you I made all the right decisions, because guess what? I made a ton of mistakes. But one of the things we taught our kids is how to manage money. We taught them how to budget money. And my oldest son, this kid is kid. He's 27 years old. I probably should stop calling him a kid. If he's listening to this, I apologize. He's a good egg, as they say. But he took the lesson. He learned from us about budgeting. He learned about having that emergency fund. He learned about saving for retirement. And that's because we made that a point. We taught them what that was like. We gave them an allowance that they worked for. It wasn't just that we just hand out the money. There was expectations. In fact, when he decided to go to college, I said to him, listen, your mom and I aren't paying for college, and we had the capacity to do it. But I said to him, you need to have skin in the game, which leads me to the next thing. Encourage your children, adult children, encourage employment, encourage career development. One of the things that just drives me crazy is when I hear parents that say, my kids are good, they'll figure it out. And they're having their fun summer. That's a bad plan. You've got to encourage employment. You've got to encourage career development. Listen, maybe they're not made for college. That's okay. Not everybody is designed for college, but start to give them some information about trades, show them different career paths, and then listen, support their career goals. If they need help to get motivated, find ways to motivate them. Take them to career fairs. Start that early. Explain to them what people do. One of the things that we did when our kids were younger, and I have an accounting practice, so I was around a lot of business people, but whenever a business person, it just reminded me of a funny story. Let me tell this story. So I'll never forget. One day we were out to eat, and I think it was my wife and myself and my younger son. I think my older son was at boarding school at the time. He went to military boarding school. And I will never forget this discussion. We were getting ready to go into a restaurant down in Smyrna, Delaware. There was a diner there. It's called the Smyrna Diner. And I remember it was really aggravating to me because my youngest son would always order a bunch of food and he would never finish it. And I didn't have an issue with paying for his meal. But I really got annoyed when he would order food and not eat it. So anyway, long story short, waitress comes up. I knew this lady. I think she was actually a client of mine. And I said to my son, I said, you don't realize how much money these waitresses and waiters make. He goes, Dad, come on. What are you trying to say? And I said, the money that you're throwing away in food, that waitress right there doesn't even earn in an hour. And he said, what are you talking about, Dad? And I said to her, I can't remember her name. Let's say her name was Leslie. I don't remember her name. Let's say it was Leslie. And Leslie came up to the table and I said, Leslie, can I ask you a really simple question? And she goes, sure. I said, can you tell my son what your hourly rate here is in the restaurant? And she goes, oh, sure. I don't mind telling him. She says, I make $2.33 an hour. Now, at the time, that was the, quote, minimum wage for servers or for waitresses. And my son looks at me and looks at his mom and he's $2 an hour? I said, yeah. And I said, and think about all the food you're wasting. Now, she also made money with tips and all that. But again, we taught our children at a very young age that responsibility, which is what I'm going to say next. And that is you've got to model responsible financial behavior. You've got to lead by example. If you're not leading by example, why do you wonder that your kids are struggling? Now, you can also support your kids in non-financial ways. It doesn't have to always be about money. You can offer them career advice. Maybe you can help them write a resume. Maybe you're good at writing stuff. Maybe you're good at helping them do job searches. I know when our youngest was looking for a job, my wife was on those job search sites and she was just shooting them text after text and email after email and saying, hey, apply for this job. Hey, apply for this job. Hey, do you need me to help you write a resume? Do you want me to help you fill out the applications? Because that is the key to it. It doesn't always come down to dollars and cents. It can also be things that you can do to help them along the path. So offer that career advice to them and offer that resume help. And another big thing you've got to do is set concrete financial goals together. If you're going to be successful in transitioning your children into being independent adult children, then sit down and work on some goals. Put some time in there. Set achievable goals and then celebrate those. Encourage your children when they save that emergency fund or when they don't have that. Like a couple weeks ago, my youngest son said to me, he says, Dad, I am so happy. He says, I paid off my credit card. And I said, son, that is fantastic. That is a great thing. And he said, listen, he said, Dad, I don't ever want to get in that situation again. So I pulled him aside. I said, okay, let's talk about how you can get to that. So here's another pro tip. With your adult children, maybe you need to use visual aids, maybe a budgeting worksheet or maybe some financial goal charts. These are all over the internet. I'm going to even encourage you, maybe set up an appointment or a Zoom call to have me sit down and talk to you. You can do that by going to askralph.com. I have helped many families. In fact, you can even get them a copy of my first book. If you go to askralph.com, you can see my book. It's called Mastering Your Finances. It's 47 pages, but that can be a good discussion point to have as a family. Show them the financial concepts, make them tangible, and engage them, as they're younger kids. I remember when I was a kid, one of the things my mom did with me is she would, put the change out. And that's how, I learned to count, learned so many things, but I also learned, what's a quarter, what's a dime, what's a nickel. So let's talk about next, communicating with your adult children. Let me ask you this question. Have you ever struggled to have that open and honest conversations? Maybe you're saying, Ralph, that sounds great, but I can't even have this conversation. So let me give you some effective ways to resolve these issues. I'm going to give you some tips for effective communication. Now, first thing I'm going to tell you, and this is true, listen, if you're a married man or you're a married woman, you got to choose the right time and place. You got to do the same thing with your kids. This is not the time to have that discussion when you're angry with your child or you're angry with your adult child or you're upset about something they're doing. That is not the time. You're too emotionally keyed up. Pick and choose your time and pick and choose your place and ensure that setting is conducive to a productive conversation. This is not the time to be in front of the TV. This is not the time for everybody to be on their cell phones. Park those things in a basket, maybe get in a car, go somewhere, leave the phones at home, go to the park, do something. But you've got to ensure that you've got the right time and place because it will not be productive if you don't have a spot to have a productive conversation. The next thing I'm going to encourage you to do is express your intentions clearly and honestly. Be transparent about your feelings. It's okay for you as a parent to say, listen, this is my expectation of you. I've said this to both of my children. I said, I don't mind helping you, but my expectation is this. If you come to me, like I talked about a few minutes ago, if you come to me looking for assistance, I will give it to you. But here's the catch. I'm going to go over your budget. What? Yes, I'm going to look at your bank statements. I'm going to look at your credit card statements and all of those things because I'm going to be transparent, but I'm also going to tell you this is what I do for a living. And as a parent, you should do the same thing. Encourage your children to do this. And then listen, at times, shut up and just actively listen to your child's perspective because guess what, parents? We don't always have the right answers. It's okay, and I'm going to encourage you. Show empathy. Have some understanding. And one of the things that the listener said was she feels like she's being manipulated. She always can't find a job. I'm not saying she's not. That's not true. But what I would say is my retort to that would be sit down with the child and say, what are the obstacles? If they're just saying, well, I can't find a job. Okay, what are you doing to find that job? Where are you putting in application? Listen, we went through this with my youngest. And my wife and I would constantly say to them, okay, where are you putting in applications? Well, I didn't do that yet. Okay, well, when are you going to do it? See, if you do that and actively listen, they're going to tell you what's going on, and then you can act on those things. Again, for clear communications, you've got to define those clear boundaries of support and set firm yet fair limits, and then be transparent about your own financial situation. If you're struggling to put money aside for retirement, say to your child, listen, Mom and Dad, or maybe you're just a single parent, we can't afford to do this, or I can't afford to do this. Here's how much I need to be setting aside for retirement. And if your children love you, and if they understand that, that will be conducive to them getting on their own. But again, you've got to create a supportive and empathetic environment and foster a positive atmosphere. And again, another tip I'm going to give you is frame actions as helping them to grow. This is not the time to sit there and judge them and say, I can't believe you haven't saved any money. I can't believe you don't have a job. Because guess what? This is what they're going to hear. Blah, blah, blah. They're not going to hear you. They're not going to hear you. So you've got to frame these things as helping them grow. Emphasize their growth. Emphasize their independence. And here's another thing I'm going to encourage you to do is share your own past financial mistakes. Share those mistakes. Share the lessons that you learned and tell them what you learned from that. Because here's the thing, and this is the truth. Kids are like sponges. Adult kids are the same way. When they hear, oh, mom had this struggle, oh, dad had this struggle, they will understand it. You will build up a positive relationship with them because they're going to hear how you struggled. Because then they're going to say, oh, yeah. Because here's the thing. You remember as a kid, you just assume your parents never been through what you've been through, right? Their parents never did that. But if you show them, hey, here's the mistakes I made. I shared this with my own kids. Like I got myself in way over my head in college with credit card debt. I said, here's what you don't want to do. And then the other thing I want you to do, two more things I'm going to encourage you to do. And I know we've gone a long time today, but I just wanted to really share this today because this is a question I get asked time and time again. But the last two things, here's the thing I want you to do. Emphasize your belief in their abilities. Be that champion for them, be the coach for them, and encourage them to believe in themselves. And this is one of the things that I've not done a good job at. This is one of the things that as I say this today, as I plan for this show, I said, you know what? I could have done a better job of encouraging my children. And I'm going to encourage you to do that. Encourage them. Tell them that they have the ability to do it because, listen, you have the capacity to break that child, but you also have the capacity to help them. And the final thing I'm going to say is celebrate their achievements. Acknowledge them and praise their progress. And here is a huge pro tip. If you're having a communication, use I statements to express your feelings and needs without sounding accusatory. This is a good thing to talk about in life. For example, I feel overwhelmed when instead of you always make me feel. Because see, here's the deal. If you're constantly pointing your finger and you're constantly telling about you, they're going to phase you out. But when you say to them, I feel, I sense, I need, then you're going to get through to them. So let's end the show with this question, because I think we need to talk about how other people have handled. So have you ever wondered how other families have navigated the challenge of supporting adult children? I'm going to share with you some examples that I've seen over my lifetime. I'm going to share some things I found on some social media, and I think these things will just be an encouragement to you. The first one is called the job seeker. Now, this is Sarah, a 27-year-old. She moved back home with her parents after graduation because she was struggling to find a job in her field, and she was relying on her parents for financial support. Now, her parents decided to set a 6-month deadline. I've talked about this a couple of times in this show. And they said to her, Sarah, that's great. You can move back in with us. Here are our rules. Here's what you're going to pay for. But there's a 6-month deadline. Well, what happened? Sarah found a job. And during that time, they agreed they would pay her basic expenses, not her wants, but her needs. And they also helped her by connecting her to a career counselor, and they encouraged her to take on part-time work in the meantime. And from what I understand, Sarah actually got a job that was a full-time job because of her parents encouraging her to do that part-time work. Here's another case study or another story I heard, and that's called the entrepreneur. This guy named Mike. Now, he was a 30-year-old aspiring entrepreneur who lived with his parents while he was trying to start his own business. A lot of people do that. They're trying to get that business off the ground. Now, his parents agreed to support him for a year. They said, look, we'll support you for a year. But here was their understanding. They had an understanding with him that he would take on a part-time job to cover some of his household expenses. They set clear boundaries about which business expenses they would cover and not cover. They weren't going to fund his resort living lifestyle or whatever that looked like. They said, here's what we're willing to do. Here's what we're willing to pay for. And finally, I'll call this one the student. Now, this is Emily. She was a 25-year-old graduate student who's living at home to save money. And again, her parents agreed to cover her living expenses while she's in school. I think that's a reasonable thing to do with the expectation that she's going to contribute to household chores. She's going to maintain good grades. And they also established a plan for her to start paying rent once she graduated and finds a job because you want to build that encouragement. So here's my final pro tip. Tailor your approach to your child's unique situation. Because listen, what works for one family might not work for another family. I don't know all the details. I don't know all the nuances of what's going on in your family. I can't answer a question that says, well, you must do 1, 2, and 3. That's why I have given you a ton of ideas, a ton of pro tips, a ton of practice ideas to do this because I don't know exactly what the dynamic is in your house. I don't know what training you have or haven't given your kids. I don't know what needs your kids have. But I will tell you this. Big overall thing. The key is open communication and clear expectations because here in the end, remember, you're not alone in this journey. That's one of the beautiful things about this, why I love doing this show. God is with you and his guidance for you is just a prayer away. And that is so important because prayer is a powerful tool that can bring you peace. It can bring you wisdom and it's okay. And it can bring you clarity, even in the most challenging situations. It's a way to invite God into your struggles and trust him because listen, God has a plan for this. So as you're praying, ask him about wisdom. Ask for wisdom in setting those boundaries and making decisions about financial support. Seek his guidance in helping you find the path for your for your children's independence. And listen, now a lot of people say don't pray about patience, but I'm going to put it here. I'm going to say pray for patience. Pray for understanding as you navigate this journey together, because guess what? You're going through it, and so are your children. And I'm going to talk to you about provision. Trust God to provide for your needs and your child needs according to his will. I'm not saying to just sit there and don't do anything about it. And the final thing I think you should pray for is unity, because let me just tell you, I've seen this play out. Pray for unity and harmony within your family, because even in the face of sibling rivalry or financial strain, that is what you really need to have. So let's get to our key takeaways for today. I just want to summarize. It's important to understand the financial reality and the reasons behind your child's extended stay. You need to understand why. That's the first starting point. I started with that, and I stand by that. Then you've got to set healthy boundaries. You got to deal with those manipulative behaviors, address that sibling rivalry, and approach the situation from a Christian perspective. I want to encourage you to encourage them with financial independence, and start that young. Do it through open communication. Do it through education and setting goals together. And then maintain a supportive and empathetic environment during these conversations. Remember this: the power of prayer in seeking God's guidance and trusting him is in his divine plan for your family. Now, listen, as I close out today, navigating this situation is a journey. It is not a destination, and it's going to require grace and wisdom. You're doing what's best for both of you. Hear me on this. If you've gotten to this point of the show, you're doing what's best for both of you, and you're taking the right approach. And if you do that right approach, you can help your child achieve financial independence while securing your own future. So I want to encourage you. If you want more of what I handle on the show every day, you can come to AskRalph.com. But I also want to encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. The newsletter will give you a daily dose of Ralph. You can find out what's going on in the show. I have tips and resources and all kinds of stuff to help you become part of our community. You get to that by going to AskRalphPodcast.com/newsletter, because I want to encourage you to be a part of our community, and let's support each other. So as I close, reflect on your own situation. Pray for wisdom and guidance, and consider having open conversations with your child. And if needed, seek help from trusted advisors or pastors. And remember this as I close today: God is with you in this journey. Trust his guidance and know that you are doing what's best for both of you. And with love and firmness, you can help your child grow into a responsible and independent adult. So thank you for joining me today. Be sure to tune in next time. I think Craig will be back next week for more insights on faith and finance. And until then, stay blessed and stay wise, and God bless you, and goodbye.
Thank you for joining us on the Ask Ralph Show. And with a simple click to subscribe, we'll invite you back to our next episode. And remember, financial issues don't have to be complicated. Just ask Ralph. The information contained in this episode of Ask Ralph is based on data available as of the date of its release. Saggio Accounting Plus and Ask Ralph Media, Inc. is under no obligation to update this content if changes occur. Applying this information to your specific situation requires careful consideration of all facts and circumstances, and any information provided is not to be considered as financial, tax, or legal advice. Please consult your tax advisor or attorney before acting on any material covered.